Rose Harlow thought she was saving a dying stranger when she found him collapsed beside his horse, 3 arrows buried deep in his back. What she didn't know was that the man bleeding out in the dirt was Winterhawk, the last surviving heir of the Ashara people, and that pulling those arrows from his flesh would bind her fate to a bloodline everyone believed had already been erased from the earth. The summer of 1874 had turned the Dakota Plains into an endless stretch of golden grass that rippled like ocean waves under a merciless sun. Rose Harlow had learned to read those waves the way sailors read the sea, watching for the subtle shifts that meant danger, the disruptions that didn't belong. She had been tracking a wounded doe for the better part of 2 hours, following the blood trail through the tall grass. When she saw the first sign that something was terribly wrong, the grass ahead was trampled in a way that spoke of violence, not the gentle pressing of grazing animals, but the chaotic thrashing of something or someone fighting for survival. Rose slowed her approach, her father's old rifle held ready across her chest, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the Dawson gang that had been terrorizing homesteads along the Missouri River. What she found instead made her breath catch in her throat. A horse stood motionless about 50 yards ahead, its reins dragging in the dirt. The animal was a magnificent paint stallion, black and white patches gleaming with sweat, but it was what lay beside the horse that made Rose break into a run. A man was collapsed face down in the grass, his body so still that for a moment she thought he was already dead. As she drew closer, she could see the arrows, 3 of them. Their fletching bright red and yellow, protruding from his back like obscene flowers. Rose dropped to her knees beside him, her rifle falling forgotten to the ground. The man was dressed in buckskin leggings and a shirt that had once been finely made, but was now soaked through with blood. His long black hair was matted with dirt and sweat, splayed across the ground like a dark halo. She pressed her fingers against his neck, searching for a pulse, and felt the faintest flutter beneath his skin. He was alive, but barely. She had seen arrow wounds before. Growing up on the frontier meant witnessing violence in all its forms, but these arrows were different. The shafts were made of ash wood, smooth and perfectly straight, and the fletching was bound with sinew in a pattern she didn't recognize. These weren't the crude weapons of raiders or desperate men. These arrows had been crafted by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who had meant to kill. Rose looked around quickly, her heart hammering in her chest. Whoever had done this could still be nearby, watching from the tall grass, waiting to finish what they had started. The paint stallion snorted softly, its dark eyes rolling with fear, but otherwise the prairie was silent. Too silent. Even the insects had stopped their buzzing, as if the land itself was holding its breath. She made her decision in an instant. She couldn't leave him here to die, not when there was even the smallest chance she could save him. Rose was no doctor, but she had helped her mother tend to enough injuries over the years to know the basics. The arrows would have to come out, and soon, before infection set in. But moving him in this condition could kill him just as surely as leaving him would. She turned her attention back to the man, studying his face for the first time. He was young, probably no more than 25, with strong features and high cheekbones. There was something about him that seemed different from the other native men she had encountered in trading posts and settlements. He carried himself, even in unconsciousness, with a kind of dignity that spoke of authority. His buckskin shirt, despite the blood, was decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns of blue and white, and around his neck hung a pendant made of turquoise and silver. Rose gently rolled him onto his side, careful not to jostle the arrows. His breathing was shallow and ragged, each exhale accompanied by a wet rattling sound that made her stomach clench with worry. The arrows had entered at an angle, one high on his left shoulder, another just below his right shoulder blade, and the third dangerously close to his spine. The wounds were still bleeding, but not as heavily as they should have been, which meant his body was already starting to shut down. She needed to get him back to her family's homestead, but it was a good 3 miles away, and she had no way to transport him except on his own horse. The stallion was skittish, dancing away every time she tried to approach it with its injured rider. Rose spoke softly to the animal, using the same gentle tone her father had taught her when working with frightened horses. Slowly, carefully, she managed to grab the trailing reins and lead the stallion closer. Getting the man onto the horse was the hardest thing Rose had ever done. He was dead weight, easily over 6 feet tall and heavily muscled. She had to half drag, half carry him to the stallion's side, whispering apologies every time she jostled one of the arrows and fresh blood seeped through his shirt. The horse stood remarkably still once it understood what she was trying to do, as if it knew its rider's life depended on cooperation. By the time she had him draped across the saddle, Rose was soaked with sweat and shaking from exertion. She tied his hands and feet together beneath the horse's belly to keep him from sliding off, then gathered her rifle and began the long walk home, leading the paint stallion by its reins. Every few minutes, she would check to make sure the man was still breathing, her fingers finding that thread-like pulse at his wrist. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Rose finally spotted the weathered wooden fence that marked the boundary of her family's land. The Harlow homestead consisted of a modest 2-room cabin, a small barn, and a chicken coop that her father had built with his own hands 5 years ago when they had first claimed this section of prairie. It wasn't much, but it was home, and right now it represented the difference between life and death for the man draped across the saddle. Her mother, Catherine Harlow, was in the vegetable garden when she looked up and saw Rose approaching with the strange horse and its unconscious rider. The color drained from her face as she dropped her basket and rushed forward, wiping her hands on her apron. Catherine was a sturdy woman in her mid-40s, with the same auburn hair as her daughter and eyes that had seen too much hardship to be easily shocked. But even she looked shaken by the sight before her. "Sweet mercy, Rose, what have you brought home?" Catherine's voice was tight with worry as she helped her daughter untie the man from the horse. Together, they managed to lower him to the ground, and Catherine immediately began examining the wounds. Her face grew more serious with each passing second. "These arrows need to come out now, but I won't lie to you, girl. He might not survive it. He's lost too much blood already." Rose's father, Thomas Harlow, emerged from the barn, where he had been repairing a broken wagon wheel. He was a tall man, with a weathered face and hands calloused from years of hard work. When he saw what his wife and daughter were dealing with, his expression turned grim. "We should have nothing to do with this," he said quietly, but there was no real conviction in his voice. Thomas Harlow was a hard man, made harder by the frontier, but he wasn't cruel. "He'll die if we don't help him," Rose said, meeting her father's eyes with a determination that surprised even herself. She had always been the obedient daughter, the one who followed rules and stayed out of trouble. But something about this moment felt different. Something about this man felt important, though she couldn't explain why. Thomas looked at the arrows, at the fine craftsmanship of the man's clothing, at the silver and turquoise pendant around his neck. His eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Those markings on his shirt," he said slowly. "I've seen something like them before, years ago, when I was trading up north. They're Ashara symbols. But that can't be right. The Ashara were wiped out almost 10 years ago by the Blackwood Company." Catherine's hands stilled in their examination of the wounds. She looked up at her husband with wide eyes. "The Ashara. Thomas, if he's one of them and anyone finds out we helped him, we could be in serious trouble. The Blackwood Company still has contracts with the territorial government. They wouldn't take kindly to us harboring someone they consider an enemy. He's just a man," Rose said firmly, though her heart was racing. She had heard the stories about the Ashara people, about how they had resisted the encroachment of settlers and mining companies onto their ancestral lands. The conflict had ended in a massacre that everyone said had left no survivors. But here was living proof that at least one Ashara had escaped that terrible day. Thomas sighed heavily and ran a hand through his graying hair. "Get him inside," he said finally. "We'll do what we can. But Rose, you need to understand something. If he survives, And if word gets out about who he is, it won't just be the Blackwood Company we'll have to worry about. There are plenty of folks around here who lost family in the skirmishes with the Ashara. They won't care that this man might have had nothing to do with those deaths. They carried him into the cabin and laid him on Rose's own bed, the only one with a soft enough mattress to risk moving him. Catherine sent Thomas to fetch her medical kit, while she and Rose carefully cut away the bloody shirt. The arrows had to come out, but it would require steady hands and nerves of steel. One wrong move, and they could sever an artery or push a barbed point deeper into vital organs. Rose held the man's shoulders steady while her mother worked on the first arrow, the one high on his left shoulder. Catherine used a knife to cut away the flesh around the shaft, her movements quick and precise. The man didn't stir, didn't make a sound, which worried Rose more than if he had been screaming. It meant he was too far gone to feel pain. The first arrow came out with a sickening wet sound, followed by a fresh gush of blood. Catherine immediately packed the wound with clean cloth and moved to the second arrow. This one was trickier, embedded deep in the muscle of his back. She had to dig for it, her fingers slick with blood, while Rose fought against the urge to look away. She kept her eyes on the man's face instead, watching for any sign of consciousness, any flicker of awareness. The second arrow finally came free, and Catherine let out a breath she had been holding. But it was the third arrow, the one near his spine, that made her pause. She looked up at Rose with genuine fear in her eyes. "This one is touching bone," she whispered. "If I pull it out wrong, he could be paralyzed. Or it could sever the spinal cord and kill him instantly. What do we do?" Rose asked, her voice barely audible. Catherine was silent for a long moment, her hands hovering over the arrow shaft. Then she straightened her shoulders and set her jaw with determination. "We pray," she said simply, and then she began to pull. The arrow came out slowly, so slowly that Rose could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. There was blood, more blood than she had ever seen, and for a horrible moment she thought they had lost him. But then his chest rose with a sudden, gasping breath, and his eyes fluttered open for just a second before closing again. In that brief moment, Rose saw his eyes, dark as midnight and filled with a pain that went deeper than physical wounds. They worked through the night, cleaning and bandaging his wounds, forcing water between his lips, changing blood-soaked cloths. Rose refused to leave his side, even when her mother suggested she get some rest. There was something about this man that had taken hold of her, some unspoken connection that defied explanation. She told herself it was simply compassion, the basic human desire to help someone in need. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Thomas came in several times during the night to check on their patient's condition. Each time he would stand in the doorway, arms crossed, watching his daughter tend to the wounded stranger with a mixture of concern and something else Rose couldn't quite identify. Finally, near midnight, he spoke. "Your mother told me about the third arrow, about how close it came to his spine. He's lucky to be alive." "Lucky might not be the right word," Rose replied, wringing out a cloth she had been using to cool the man's fever. His skin was burning hot to the touch, his body fighting infection with every ounce of strength it had left. Someone wanted him dead badly enough to put 3 arrows in his back. "That's not random violence, Pa. That's an execution." Thomas nodded slowly, his weathered face grave in the lamplight. "I've been thinking about that. About who would want to kill an Ashara, and why they would do it now, all these years after the massacre. The Blackwood Company claimed they wiped out the entire tribe, killed every man, woman and child. If this man survived, if he's been hiding all this time, someone must have finally found him. Or he stopped hiding." Catherine interjected quietly from where she sat mending one of Rose's dresses by the fire. "Maybe he came out of hiding for a reason, and that's what got him killed. Or nearly killed." Rose looked down at the man's face, peaceful now in unconscious sleep, despite the fever ravaging his body. She wondered what his story was, what had brought him to this desperate point. Had he been alone all these years, the last survivor of his people? Or were there others, hiding in the mountains and forests, waiting for a chance to reclaim what had been taken from them? The night dragged on with agonizing slowness. Rose dozed fitfully in the chair beside the bed, jerking awake every time the man's breathing changed or he made a sound. Round 3 in the morning, he began to speak, words tumbling from his lips in a language Rose didn't understand. His eyes were still closed, his body thrashing weakly against the blankets as fever dreams consumed him. She placed a hand on his forehead, feeling the heat radiating from his skin, and spoke softly to him. "You're safe," she said, not knowing if he could hear her, if the words meant anything to him in his delirium. "You're safe here. No one is going to hurt you." Her words seemed to calm him, or perhaps it was simply the cool touch of her hand. His thrashing subsided, and he settled back into the bed with a long, shuddering sigh. Rose kept her hand on his forehead, feeling his fever slowly begin to break as dawn approached. By the time the first light of morning crept through the cabin windows, his skin was cooler, his breathing steadier. As dawn broke over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Winterhawk finally opened his eyes and looked directly at Rose. For a moment, neither of them moved, neither of them spoke. Then his lips formed a single word in English, spoken so softly she almost missed it. "Why?" he asked, and in that one word was a universe of questions. Rose didn't have an answer, not one that made sense, so she simply said, "Because you needed help." He studied her face for a long moment, as if memorizing every feature, and then his eyes closed again, and he slipped back into unconsciousness. But Rose had seen something in that brief exchange, something that told her this man was not just another victim of frontier violence. He was someone important, someone whose survival might mean more than she could possibly understand. She sat back in her chair, exhausted but unable to sleep, and watched the sun rise through the cabin window. The prairie was waking up, birds singing their morning songs, the wind rustling through the grass. Everything looked normal, peaceful, as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. But Rose knew better. She had made a choice when she pulled those arrows from Winterhawk's back, a choice that would change both of their lives forever. She just didn't know yet how profound those changes would be, or what price they would both have to pay for this moment of mercy. Winterhawk didn't wake again for 3 full days. During that time, Rose kept vigil at his bedside while her parents went about the difficult work of maintaining the homestead. The summer heat pressed down on the cabin like a physical weight, making the air thick and hard to breathe. Rose changed his bandages twice daily, noting with relief that the wounds were beginning to close without signs of infection. Whatever herbs her mother had packed into the wounds were doing their job. On the morning of the 4th day, Rose was dozing in her chair when a sound made her eyes snap open. Winterhawk was awake, truly awake this time, his dark eyes clear and focused as he took in his surroundings. He tried to sit up, but the movement sent a spasm of pain across his face, and he fell back against the pillows with a sharp intake of breath. "Don't move," Rose said quickly, leaning forward. "Your wounds are still healing." "You'll tear the stitches if you're not careful." He turned his head to look at her, and she saw wariness in his eyes, mixed with confusion. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "Where am I?" "Who are you?" My name is Rose Harlow. You're in my family's homestead, about 15 miles west of the Missouri River. I found you 4 days ago, dying beside your horse with 3 arrows in your back. Do you remember what happened?" Winterhawk's jaw tightened, and something dark and painful flickered across his face. "I remember," he said quietly. His hand moved to his chest, feeling for something, and panic flashed in his eyes when he didn't find it. "My pendant. Where is my pendant?" "It's safe," Rose assured him, reaching for the small wooden box on the bedside table where her mother had stored his belongings. She opened it and pulled out the turquoise and silver pendant, holding it up so he could see. "We kept all your things here." The relief on his face was palpable. He reached for the pendant with trembling fingers, and Rose placed it carefully in his palm. He closed his hand around it, bringing it to his chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "This belonged to my father," he said softly, "and his father before him. It is all I have left of my people." Rose wanted to ask him about that, about the Ashara and the massacre and how he had survived, but she could see he was exhausted from even this brief conversation. "You should rest," she said. "We can talk more when you're stronger." But Winterhawk shook his head. "No, I need to tell you something first. You saved my life, and that creates a debt I may never be able to repay. But you also put yourself and your family in great danger by bringing me here. The men who shot me, they will come looking for me. They won't stop until they finish what they started." A chill ran down Rose's spine, despite the summer heat. "Who were they? Why do they want you dead?" "Because of who I am," Winterhawk said, his voice heavy with a burden Rose couldn't yet understand. "Because of what I represent. My name is Winterhawk, son of Chief Grey Mountain, grandson of Chief Standing Bear. I am the last of the Ashara bloodline, the last heir to lands that powerful men have claimed as their own." Rose's breath caught in her throat. Her father had been right about the symbols on his clothing, but neither of them had imagined they were sheltering not just an Ashara survivor, but the rightful heir to the entire nation. "The Blackwood Company," she whispered. "They're the ones who attacked your people. They attacked under orders from the territorial government," Winterhawk confirmed, his voice bitter. "My people had refused to sign away our ancestral lands, refused to move to the reservation they had designated for us. So they decided to eliminate the problem permanently. They came at dawn, while most of our warriors were away hunting. They killed everyone they could find, burned our village to the ground, and declared the Ashara extinct. But you survived," Rose said. "I was away that day, tracking a mountain cat that had been killing our horses. By the time I returned, everything was gone. My father, my mother, my 2 younger sisters, my grandfather, who had taught me everything I know about being a leader. All gone. I was 17 years old, and in one day I became the last of my line." The pain in his voice was raw and immediate, as if the massacre had happened yesterday instead of nearly a decade ago. Rose felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Where have you been all these years?" "Hiding," Winterhawk said simply. "Moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough for people to ask questions. I took work where I could find it, always using a different name, always keeping my heritage secret. For 8 years I lived like a ghost, mourning my people in silence." "What changed?" Rose asked. "Why did you stop hiding?" Winterhawk's hand tightened around his pendant. "Because hiding is not living. Because my father taught me that a leader must stand for his people, even when his people are gone. I discovered that the massacre was based on a lie. The territorial government claimed my father had signed a treaty ceding our lands to them, but I know my father would never have done that. The treaty was a forgery, created to give legal cover to murder and theft, and you have proof of this." Rose leaned forward, her heart racing. "I did," Winterhawk said grimly. 3 months ago, I broke into the territorial archives in Denver. I found the original documents, including correspondence between the governor and the Blackwood Company, discussing how to handle the Ashara problem. I made copies of everything, proof that could bring down some very powerful men. That's why they want me dead. Not because I'm Ashara, but because I have evidence of their crimes." Rose felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. This wasn't just about one man's survival anymore. This was about justice for an entire people who had been murdered for their land. "Where are these documents now?" "Hidden," Winterhawk said, "in a place only I know. But I was on my way to meet with a newspaper editor in Kansas City, a man who had agreed to publish the evidence when the Blackwood men found me. There were 5 of them, hired guns who had been tracking me for weeks. They ambushed me at dawn 2 days' ride from here. How did you escape with 3 arrows in your back?" Rose couldn't imagine the strength that would have required. A ghost of a smile crossed Winterhawk's face. "My horse is faster than theirs and more loyal. Storm Runner carried me even after I had passed out from blood loss. I think he was trying to bring me home, to the place where our village once stood. But I fell from the saddle before we got that far. I thought I was going to die there in the grass alone, and then you found me." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his story settling between them. Finally Rose spoke. My father says the Blackwood Company has contracts with the territorial government. If what you're saying is true, if you have proof they committed murder to steal land, they'll do anything to keep that information from coming out. I know, Winterhawk said. That's why I'm telling you this. You need to know what you've gotten yourself into by saving me. These men are ruthless. They've already killed hundreds to protect their interests. They won't hesitate to kill you and your family too. Fear coiled in Rose's stomach, but alongside it was something else. Anger, righteous fury at the injustice of it all. Then we need to make sure your evidence reaches that newspaper editor. We need to make sure your people's story is told. Winterhawk studied her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. Why would you do this? You don't know me. My people were enemies of yours. You could hand me over to the authorities right now and probably receive a reward. Why would you risk everything for a stranger? Rose thought about that question, searching for an answer that made sense. Finally, she said, because what happened to your people was wrong. Because justice matters more than safety. And because when I found you dying in that grass, I made a choice. I'm not going to undo that choice just because it turns out to be more complicated than I thought. Something shifted in Winterhawk's expression, a softening around his eyes. You are either very brave or very foolish, Rose Harlow. Probably both, she admitted with a small smile. But that doesn't change what needs to be done. You need to heal, and then we need to figure out how to get you and your evidence to Kansas City without the Blackwood Company finding you first. Before Winterhawk could respond, the cabin door opened, and Thomas Harlow stepped inside. His eyes went immediately to the bed, taking in the fact that their patient was awake and talking. His expression was unreadable as he walked over to stand beside Rose. I see you're feeling better, he said to Winterhawk. Thanks to your daughter and your wife, Winterhawk replied. I owe my life to this family? Thomas nodded slowly. Rose told us who you are, or rather, who she thinks you are based on the symbols on your clothing. She says you're a Shara. I am, Winterhawk confirmed. I am Winterhawk, son of Grey Mountain, last of the Ashara line. Thomas pulled up a chair and sat down heavily. He looked older than his years in that moment, worn down by the harsh life of the frontier. I was in the cavalry 20 years ago, he said quietly. Before I married Catherine and settled here, I fought in campaigns against various tribes, did things I'm not proud of. I saw what happens when the government decides a group of people is standing in the way of progress. It's never pretty, and it's rarely just. Rose looked at her father in surprise. He rarely spoke about his military service, always changing the subject when it came up. Now she understood why. But I'm not a young soldier anymore, Thomas continued. I'm a father and a husband with responsibilities. My first duty is to keep my family safe. And right now having you here puts us all in danger. I know, Winterhawk said. I have already told Rose the same thing. As soon as I am able to travel, I will leave and take the danger with me. I would not ask any family to sacrifice their safety for my cause. The problem is, Thomas said, leaning back in his chair, you're not able to travel. Not for at least another week, maybe 2. Those wounds need time to heal. And if you push yourself too hard too fast, you'll either tear them open or collapse from weakness. So whether we like it or not, you're stuck here for a while. Then I will leave tonight, Winterhawk said, trying again to sit up. I will not put you at risk for one more day than necessary. Stop being stupid, Catherine Harlow said sharply from the doorway, making everyone turn to look at her. She had been listening from the other room, and now she walked in carrying a bowl of broth. You can barely lift your head off the pillow. You'd make it maybe a mile before you passed out and died of exposure. Then my daughter's efforts to save you would have been for nothing, and I don't take kindly to wasted effort. Despite everything, Winterhawk smiled. You have a formidable wife, Mr. Harlow. Don't I know it, Thomas said with a sigh. Catherine, what are you suggesting? And I'm suggesting we do what's right, Catherine said firmly, setting the bowl down on the bedside table. This man was wronged. His people were wronged. We have a chance to help him set things right, and I think we should take it, even if it means putting Rose in danger. Thomas asked. Catherine looked at her daughter, and Rose saw a fierce pride in her mother's eyes. Rose is 20 years old, Thomas. She's not a child anymore. She saved this man's life because she knew it was the right thing to do. I won't undermine that choice by throwing him out before he's healed. What kind of people would that make us? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped together as he thought. Finally, he nodded.
All right.
You can stay until you're well enough to travel safely, but we need to be smart about this. If anyone comes asking questions, Winterhawk, you're a ranch hand from Montana who got caught in a dispute over cards. We found you after your horse threw you, and we're nursing you back to health out of Christian charity. No mention of arrows, no mention of the Ashara, no mention of any documents. Agreed, Winterhawk said. And I swear to you I will repay this kindness however I can. Just stay alive long enough to tell your people's story, Thomas said, standing up. That will be payment enough. Now Catherine brought you some broth. You need to eat and build your strength back up. Rose, come help your mother in the kitchen. We need to let him rest. Rose started to protest, but her mother gave her a look that brooked no argument. Reluctantly, she stood and followed her parents out of the room, leaving Winterhawk alone with his thoughts and his pendant. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the kitchen, Thomas poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table. This is going to get complicated, he said to no one in particular. The Blackwood Company has eyes everywhere. If they're looking for him, they'll eventually search every homestead within 100 miles. Then we'll be ready, Catherine said, kneading bread dough with more force than necessary. We'll hide him if we have to, lie if we have to. We've survived drought and locusts and everything else this land has thrown at us. We can survive this too. Rose poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her father. Pa, you said you saw things in the cavalry that you weren't proud of. Is that why you're willing to help him? Because you're trying to make up for past mistakes? Thomas looked at his daughter with sad, tired eyes. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just trying to make sure I can look at myself in the mirror when this is all over. Your mother is right about one thing. What happened to the Ashara was wrong. If we have a chance to help bring some justice to the situation, we should take it. Even if it's dangerous, even if it costs us, it won't come to that, Rose said with more confidence than she felt. We'll keep him hidden, help him heal, and then he can be on his way to Kansas City. No one has to know he was ever here. But even as she said the words, Rose knew they were probably foolish. The Blackwood Company hadn't stayed in power by being careless or stupid. If they wanted Winterhawk dead, they would search until they found him. And when they did, they would find the Harlow family too. The only question was whether they could get Winterhawk to Kansas City and his evidence to that newspaper editor before the hunters caught up with them. That night, after her parents had gone to bed, Rose crept back into the room where Winterhawk lay sleeping. She sat in her chair and watched him breathe, this man who had brought danger and purpose into her quiet life. His face was peaceful in sleep, the lines of pain smoothed away. She wondered what he had been like before the massacre, when he was still a prince of his people, when his future had stretched before him bright with possibility. As if sensing her presence, Winterhawk's eyes opened. They looked at each other in the lamplight, and Rose felt something pass between them, some understanding that went beyond words. "You should be sleeping," he said softly. "So should you," she replied. "I sleep better knowing someone is keeping watch," he admitted. "For 8 years I've slept with one eye open, always listening for the sound of approaching danger. It's hard to break that habit." "You're safe here," Rose said. "For now, at least." "You can rest." Winterhawk smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Safety is an illusion, Rose Harlow. The only real safety is in being prepared for danger when it comes. And it will come. The question is whether we'll be ready for it." Rose thought about that as she sat there in the lamplight, keeping vigil over this man who had stumbled into her life and changed everything. She thought about the documents he had hidden, the evidence that could bring down powerful men and give voice to the murdered Ashara people. She thought about the newspaper editor in Kansas City, waiting for information that might never come. And she thought about her own life, the quiet existence she had been living, going through the motions of each day without any real purpose or passion. Saving Winterhawk had given her something she hadn't even known she was missing. A cause worth fighting for, a reason to be brave. And looking at him now, at this man who carried the weight of his people's extinction on his shoulders, she made a silent promise. She would help him reach Kansas City. She would help him tell his people's story. Whatever it cost her, whatever dangers lay ahead, she would see this through to the end. The first sign of trouble came 6 days after Rose had found Winterhawk in the prairie grass. It was mid-morning, and she was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she noticed dust rising on the eastern horizon. 3 riders, moving slowly, methodically, as if searching for something. Her stomach dropped as she watched them approach, and she quickly gathered up the remaining wet clothes and hurried inside. "Pa," she called out, trying to keep her voice calm. "We have visitors coming." Thomas immediately set down the harness he had been mending and moved to the window. His face went grim as he watched the riders approach. "Catherine, get Winterhawk hidden now. Rose, act natural. These could just be drifters looking for work or water, but we're not taking chances." Catherine moved quickly, helping Winterhawk out of the bed despite his protests. He was stronger now, able to walk short distances without assistance, though the effort still left him breathless and pale. They had prepared for this possibility, clearing out a space beneath the floorboards in the root cellar where a man could hide if necessary. It was cramped and uncomfortable, but it would keep him out of sight. By the time the riders reached the cabin, Winterhawk was hidden and Rose was back outside, calmly continuing with her laundry as if nothing was amiss. The 3 men who dismounted were hard-looking characters, the kind of men who wore their violence like a second skin. The one in front was tall and rangy, with a scar running down the left side of his face. He smiled when he saw Rose, but there was no warmth in it. "Afternoon, miss," he said, tipping his hat. "Name's Coleman. We're working for the Blackwood Company, tracking a fugitive who attacked one of our supply wagons about a week back. Wounded man, probably riding a paint horse. You folks seen anyone like that around here?" Rose's heart was pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it, but she kept her face neutral and her voice steady. "No, sir, can't say we have. We don't get many visitors out here." Thomas emerged from the cabin, his rifle held loosely in his hands, not pointing at anyone but present nonetheless. "Something we can help you gentlemen with?" Coleman turned his attention to Thomas, sizing him up with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to evaluating threats. "Just asking about a fugitive, friend. Dangerous man, stole some valuable property from the company. We've been tracking him for over a week now, and his trail led us in this direction. Like my daughter said, we haven't seen anyone," Thomas replied. "But if this man is as dangerous as you say, maybe you should tell us what he looks like, so we can keep an eye out." One of the other men, shorter and stockier than Coleman, spoke up. Injun, long black hair, probably wearing buckskin. "Riding a black and white paint stallion? Man would be wounded, maybe badly. Anyone harboring him would be breaking the law and subject to prosecution." "We're law-abiding folks," Thomas said evenly. "If we see this man, we'll be sure to report it to the proper authorities in town." Coleman's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's all we're asking. Mind if we water our horses? It's been a long, hot ride." Thomas hesitated for just a moment, long enough for Rose to see the calculation in his eyes. Refusing would raise suspicions, but allowing them to stay even a few minutes was dangerous. Finally, he nodded. "Well's around back. Help yourselves." As the 3 men led their horses toward the well, Rose caught her father's eye. He gave her a subtle shake of his head, warning her to stay calm and not do anything that might give them away. She nodded and went back to hanging laundry. Though her hands were shaking so badly, she could barely manage the clothespins. Coleman took his time watering his horse, his eyes constantly moving, taking in every detail of the homestead. He walked around the side of the cabin, peering in through windows, and Rose saw him pause when he noticed the paint stallion in the small corral next to the barn. Stormrunner had been there for nearly a week now, and they had hoped no one would notice one more horse among their small herd. But Coleman noticed. "That's a fine-looking paint you've got there," he called out to Thomas. "Don't see many of that quality out this way. Where'd you come by him?" Rose felt her blood turn to ice. Thomas didn't miss a beat. Traded for him last month up in Deadwood. Fellow needed cash more than he needed a good horse. Seemed like a fair deal to me. Coleman walked closer to the corral, studying Stormrunner with an intensity that made Rose want to scream. The horse watched him back, ears flattened against his head, clearly not liking what he saw. "Funny thing," Coleman said slowly. "The fugitive we're tracking, the one who stole from the Blackwood Company. He was riding a paint that looks an awful lot like this one." Thomas's grip on his rifle tightened, almost imperceptibly. "You calling me a liar?" The tension in the air became thick enough to cut. Coleman turned to face Thomas, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Not calling you anything, just noting the coincidence. Men would have to be pretty stupid to help a fugitive, especially one wanted by the Blackwood Company. Or pretty brave. Can't always tell which." "Or maybe," Rose spoke up, her voice stronger than she felt. "There's more than one paint horse in the Dakota Territory. Stormrunner has been with us for weeks. If you don't believe my father, you can check with the folks in town. They'll vouch for us." Coleman studied her for a long moment, and Rose forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. Finally he smiled that cold smile again. "I'm sure they would. Neighbors tend to stick together out here. But let me give you folks some friendly advice. The Blackwood Company doesn't take kindly to people interfering in their business. If you happen to come across this fugitive, the smart thing would be to turn him in. There's a $500 reward. No questions asked." $500 was more money than the Harlow family would see in 2 years of hard work. It was meant to be tempting, but all Rose felt was disgust. They were offering blood money for Winterhawk's life, trying to turn neighbors into bounty hunters. She kept her expression neutral and said nothing. The 3 men mounted their horses, but Coleman paused before riding off. "One more thing. The fugitive we're looking for, he's not just a thief, he's a murderer. Killed 3 good men in cold blood, so if you do see him, don't try to be a hero. Just send word to the Blackwood office in town, and we'll handle it from there." Thomas nodded curtly. "We'll keep that in mind." They watched in silence as the 3 riders disappeared back into the prairie, their dust trail gradually fading into the shimmering heat. Only when they were completely out of sight did Rose allow herself to breathe normally again. Her legs felt weak, and she had to sit down on the porch steps before they gave out entirely. Catherine emerged from the cabin, her face pale. "They're gone." "For now," Thomas said grimly, "but they'll be back." Coleman didn't believe us about the horse. "He's suspicious, and suspicious men are dangerous men. We need to move Winterhawk tonight, get him somewhere safer." "Move him where?" Rose asked. "He's still healing. He can't ride hard, and he can't hide in the wilderness without supplies." "I know," Thomas said, frustration evident in his voice. "But keeping him here is too risky now. Those men will be watching, waiting for us to slip up. And if they come back with more men, with legal authority to search the property, we won't be able to protect him." They brought Winterhawk up from his hiding place in the root cellar. He was covered in dust and clearly uncomfortable from being cramped in the small space, but his first concern was for them. "I heard everything," he said. "I need to leave tonight. I won't let you risk your lives any further for my sake." "You can barely walk 20 feet without getting winded," Rose protested. "How are you supposed to make it to Kansas City in your condition?" "I'll manage," Winterhawk said, though they all knew it was bravado. "I've survived worse, and I have no choice. Those men weren't just Blackwood hired guns. The one called Coleman, I recognized his voice. He was one of the men who ambushed me, one of the men who put those arrows in my back. He knows I'm alive, and he knows I'm somewhere in this area. He won't stop searching until he finds me." Catherine wrung her hands anxiously. "There has to be another way. Someplace we can hide him that's safer than the root cellar." Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then his eyes lit up with an idea. The Hutchinson place. You remember them, Catherine? They had that homestead about 8 miles north of here, abandoned it 2 years ago when the drought killed their crops. The cabin's still standing, last I heard. It's isolated off the main trails. Winterhawk could hide there while he continues to recover, and we could bring him supplies without drawing attention. That could work, Catherine said slowly. But how do we get him there without being seen? If those Blackwood men are watching, they'll notice if we leave with an extra rider. We go at night, Rose said. And I'll take him. One rider is less conspicuous than 2 or 3, and I know the way to the Hutchinson place. I used to go there with Mrs. Hutchinson to gather herbs from her garden. Absolutely not, Thomas said immediately. It's too dangerous. If those men find you alone with him, they'll kill you both. And if we do nothing, they'll eventually find him here and kill all of us, Rose countered. At least this way we have a chance. We can make it look like I'm just going out to check on our north fence line. They do that regularly enough that it won't seem suspicious. Winterhawk can hide in the back of the wagon under some hay until we're far enough away from the homestead. Winterhawk looked at Rose with something like admiration in his eyes. You would do this? Risk yourself to help me reach safety? I didn't pull 3 arrows out of your back just to watch the Blackwood Company put 3 more in, Rose said firmly. Besides, those men murdered your entire people based on lies and greed. Someone needs to hold them accountable. If getting you to Kansas City helps do that, then it's worth the risk. Thomas looked at his daughter, and Rose saw the moment he recognized that she had already made up her mind. He sighed heavily. You're as stubborn as your mother. All right, but we do this smart. You'll take the wagon and enough supplies to make it look like you're planning to be gone for a few days. Say you're going to check the fence line and maybe do some hunting while you're out there. Take your rifle, take provisions. Make it look normal. And take this, Catherine said, pressing a small derringer into Rose's hand. Keep it hidden, but keep it close. If those men find you, don't hesitate. Shoot first and ask questions later. Rose had never fired a gun at anything but game animals, but she took the derringer and tucked it into her boot. The weight of it was both comforting and terrifying. She hoped desperately that she would never have to use it. They spent the rest of the day preparing for the journey. Catherine packed food and medical supplies, along with blankets and extra clothing for Winterhawk. Thomas loaded the wagon with hay, creating a hollow space in the middle where a man could hide. They worked quickly but carefully, trying to maintain the appearance of normal daily activities in case they were being watched. As darkness fell, they made their final preparations. Winterhawk changed out of his buckskin clothing and into a set of Thomas's old work clothes. They weren't a perfect fit, but they would help him blend in if anyone saw him. He moved slowly, clearly in pain, but he didn't complain. Rose could see the determination in his eyes, the fierce will to survive that had kept him alive for 8 years after losing everything. Remember, Thomas said as he helped Winterhawk into the wagon and covered him with hay. If you run into trouble, abandon the wagon and run. Don't try to be a hero, Rose. Your life is more important than any mission. I'll be careful, Pa, Rose promised, climbing up onto the wagon seat. She took the reins in her hands and looked back at her parents standing in the doorway of the cabin. They looked small and vulnerable in the lamplight, and she felt a sudden surge of love for them. They were risking everything to help a stranger, not because they expected anything in return, but simply because it was right. Rose, her mother called out softly. Come home safe, I will, Rose said, though she wasn't sure it was a promise she could keep. She clicked her tongue, and the horses started forward, pulling the wagon out of the yard and onto the narrow trail that led north. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see by, and Rose kept the horses at a steady pace, not too fast, which might draw attention, but not too slow either. Behind her, buried in the hay, Winterhawk was silent and still. They had been traveling for about an hour when Rose heard it, the sound of hoofbeats behind them growing closer. Her heart started racing, and she resisted the urge to look back. It might be nothing, just another traveler on the trail. But it might also be Coleman and his men, following to see where she was going. The rider came alongside the wagon, and Rose's blood ran cold when she saw it was the stocky man who had been with Coleman earlier. He grinned at her, showing yellowed teeth. "Little late for a ride, isn't it, miss?" Rose forced herself to smile back. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd get an early start on checking the north fence. We've had coyotes getting at the chickens. That so?" The man's eyes moved over the wagon, taking in the hay piled in the back. "Seems like a lot of hay for a fence inspection, taking it up to store in the old Hutchinson barn," Rose said, the lie coming more easily than she would have expected. "No sense letting good hay go to waste when we've got storage space standing empty." The man rode in silence for a moment, and Rose could practically feel him trying to decide whether to believe her. Finally, he said, "Well, you be careful out here alone. Like Mr. Coleman said, there's a dangerous fugitive on the loose. Wouldn't want anything bad to happen to a pretty young lady like yourself." There was something in his tone that made Rose's skin crawl, but she kept her expression neutral. "I appreciate the concern. I'll be fine." The man tipped his hat and spurred his horse forward, riding ahead until he disappeared into the darkness. Rose waited until she could no longer hear his hoofbeats before allowing herself to relax slightly. Beneath the hay, Winterhawk stirred. "Is he gone?" His voice came out muffled. "Yes, but he's suspicious," Rose whispered back. "Stay hidden until I tell you it's safe." They continued on through the night, and Rose found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, jumping at every sound. The prairie at night was alive with noises, the rustling of small animals in the grass, the calls of night birds, the whisper of wind. Any of those sounds could be hiding the approach of danger. It was nearly dawn when they finally reached the abandoned Hutchinson homestead. The cabin stood dark and empty, its windows like blind eyes staring out at the prairie. Rose drove the wagon around to the back, where it would be hidden from the main trail, and then helped Winterhawk climb down from his hiding place. He was stiff and sore from lying still for so long, and he leaned heavily on her as they made their way to the cabin door. The inside of the cabin was dusty and filled with the musty smell of abandonment, but it was dry and relatively clean. Rose helped Winterhawk to the bed in the corner and then went about making the place habitable. She swept the floor, opened the shutters to let in fresh air, and started a small fire in the hearth. By the time the sun was fully up, the cabin looked almost cozy. Winterhawk watched her work with an expression she couldn't quite read. Finally, he said, "You didn't have to do this. You could have turned me in, collected that reward money. $500 would change your family's life." Rose paused in her sweeping and looked at him. "Some things are more important than money. Justice, truth, doing what's right even when it's hard. My parents taught me that, and I believe it. Your parents are remarkable people," Winterhawk said softly. "And so are you, Rose Harlow. I don't know how I will ever repay this debt." "Help me understand something," Rose said, setting down the broom and sitting in the chair across from him. "Coleman said you killed 3 men. Is that true?" Winterhawk's face hardened. "It's true. They were Blackwood security guards, and I killed them while breaking into the archives in Denver. But they weren't innocent men, Rose. They were the same men who participated in the massacre of my people. I recognized them. One of them had laughed while he burned my grandfather's medicine lodge. Another had boasted about how many Ashara children he had shot. So yes, I killed them. And I would do it again." Rose felt a chill run through her. This was not the clear-cut story of good versus evil she had imagined. Winterhawk was not just a victim seeking justice. He was also a man who had taken lives, who had blood on his hands. It complicated things in ways she wasn't prepared to deal with. "Does that change things?" Winterhawk asked, watching her face carefully. "Does knowing I'm a killer make you regret helping me?" Rose thought about that question for a long time before answering. Finally, she said, "I don't know. What they did to your people was wrong, inexcusably wrong. But killing them doesn't bring your family back. It doesn't undo the massacre. All it does is add more death to an already terrible situation." "You're right," Winterhawk said quietly. "It doesn't bring them back. Nothing will bring them back. But those men needed to answer for their crimes, and there was no legal way to make that happen. The courts, the government, they were all complicit in what happened. So I took justice into my own hands. Maybe that makes me no better than them. But at least I can look my ancestors in the eye when I join them in the spirit world. They sat in silence, the weight of these revelations hanging between them. Outside, the sun continued its climb into the sky, promising another hot day. Rose knew she needed to get back to the homestead before her parents started worrying, but she was reluctant to leave Winterhawk alone. He was still weak, still vulnerable. If Coleman and his men found this place, he wouldn't be able to defend himself. As if reading her thoughts, Winterhawk said, "You should go. The longer you stay, the more suspicious it will look. I'll be fine here. I've survived 8 years on my own. I can survive a few more days." Rose nodded reluctantly and stood up. "I'll come back tomorrow night with more supplies and to check on your wounds. In the meantime, stay hidden. Don't light fires during the day when the smoke might be seen. And if anyone comes, hide first and ask questions later." "I will," Winterhawk promised. "Rose, thank you for everything." She gave him a small smile and then left, climbing back onto the wagon for the long ride home. As she drove away from the abandoned homestead, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just crossed some invisible line, that her life would never be the same again. She had thrown her lot in with a fugitive, a killer, a man whose very existence threatened powerful interests. There was no going back now, no way to undo what had been done. All she could do was move forward and hope that somehow, some way, this would all end with justice being served rather than more blood being spilled. Rose made it back to the homestead just as the sun was climbing toward its zenith, the wagon wheels kicking up small clouds of dust on the dry trail. Her parents were waiting anxiously in the yard, and the relief on their faces when they saw her was palpable. Thomas helped her down from the wagon, while Catherine immediately began checking her over, as if expecting to find injuries. Everything went smoothly, Rose assured them, though her voice was tired. "We made it to the Hutchinson place without incident. Well, mostly without incident. One of Coleman's men followed me for a bit, but I convinced him I was just moving hay." Thomas's jaw tightened. "They're watching us then. We need to be even more careful. Any trips to the Hutchinson place need to look completely routine, nothing that would raise suspicions." Over the next week, Rose fell into a pattern. Every other night, she would load the wagon with supplies, hidden beneath whatever excuse she could manufacture. Hay, tools that needed storing, even a broken chair she claimed to be taking to use for firewood. Then she would make the journey to the abandoned homestead, always watching for signs that she was being followed, always ready with an explanation if stopped. Winterhawk grew stronger with each passing day. The wounds on his back were healing cleanly, the angry red gradually fading to pink scar tissue. He could move without pain now, and Rose often found him pacing the small cabin like a caged animal, restless and eager to continue his journey to Kansas City. But they both knew he wasn't ready yet, that pushing too hard too fast would only risk reopening his wounds. During her visits, they talked, long conversations that stretched through the night hours, sharing stories and histories that bridged the gap between their vastly different worlds. Winterhawk told her about life before the massacre, about growing up as the son of a chief, learning the traditions and responsibilities that came with leadership. He described ceremonies and celebrations, the changing of seasons marked by ancient rituals, the deep connection his people had felt to the land itself. "We didn't see the land as something to own," he explained one night, as they sat by the small fire Rose had built after ensuring no one was nearby to see the smoke. "We were part of it, caretakers rather than masters. The idea of buying and selling earth and sky made no sense to us. It would be like trying to buy the wind or sell the rain." Rose found herself fascinated by these glimpses into a culture so different from her own. She had grown up surrounded by settlers who viewed the land as something to be conquered and tamed, resources to be extracted and exploited. The idea that land could be sacred, that it could have spirit and memory, was foreign but strangely compelling. In return, she told him about her own life, about growing up as the daughter of a former cavalry soldier who had turned his back on violence to build something peaceful. She spoke about her mother's strength, the quiet resilience that had kept their family together through droughts and hardships. And she found herself sharing dreams she had never spoken aloud before, about wanting more than just survival, about yearning for purpose and meaning beyond the daily struggle of frontier life. "You have that now," Winterhawk said quietly. "Purpose, I mean. What you're doing, helping me, it matters. Not just to me, but to the memory of my people. Their story deserves to be told, and you're making that possible." "I hope so," Rose said, poking at the fire with a stick. "Sometimes I wonder if we're being naive. The Blackwood Company has money and power and the law on their side. What chance does one man's testimony have against all that?" "The truth has its own power," Winterhawk replied. "Lies can only stand for so long before they collapse under their own weight. The documents I have, they prove beyond doubt that the territorial government and the Blackwood Company conspire to commit genocide for profit. Once that information is public, once people see the evidence with their own eyes, they won't be able to ignore it." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "You have a lot of faith in people's capacity for justice," Rose observed. Winterhawk smiled, though there was sadness in it. "Not faith exactly, more like desperate hope. Because if we can't trust that the truth matters, that justice is possible, then what are we fighting for? We might as well lie down and let the powerful do whatever they want." It was during one of these late-night conversations that Rose first noticed the shift in how she felt about Winterhawk. It wasn't just admiration for his courage or sympathy for his losses anymore. There was something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster when she arrived at the cabin and saw him waiting by the window. Something that made her reluctant to leave, even when the sky began to lighten with approaching dawn. She tried to ignore these feelings, to push them down and focus on the practical matters at hand. This wasn't the time for romantic complications. Winterhawk was still in danger, still healing, still focused on completing his mission. And even if he did feel something similar, what future could there possibly be for them? Their worlds were too different, the obstacles too great. But ignoring her feelings became increasingly difficult, especially as she noticed Winterhawk watching her with an intensity that suggested his own thoughts might be moving in similar directions. There were moments when their hands would brush accidentally and neither would pull away immediately. Times when their eyes would meet across the small cabin and hold for heartbeats longer than necessary. It was on the 10th night, after she had brought him to the Hutchinson place, that everything changed. Rose arrived later than usual, having been delayed by an unexpected visit from neighbors who had stopped by the Harlow homestead asking about borrowing tools. By the time she finally made it to the abandoned cabin, Winterhawk was agitated, pacing the floor with visible anxiety. "I thought something had happened to you," he said as soon as she walked through the door. "I thought Coleman's men had found you, that you were in trouble." "I'm fine," Rose assured him, setting down the basket of supplies she had brought. "Just delayed by visitors." "Why are you so worried?" Winterhawk stopped pacing and looked at her, really looked at her, and Rose saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression. "Because I care what happens to you," he said simply. "More than I should, more than is wise. But I can't help it. These past days, talking with you, getting to know you, it's meant more to me than I can express. You've become important to me, Rose Harlow." Rose's breath caught in her throat. She had hoped, but she hadn't been sure. Hearing him voice feelings that echoed her own made something tight in her chest suddenly loosen. "You've become important to me too," she admitted. "I know this is complicated. I know there are 100 reasons why we should keep things strictly practical. But I can't stop thinking about you. Even when I'm home, supposedly focused on chores and responsibilities, my mind is here with you." Winterhawk crossed the space between them in 3 long strides. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the calluses on his palms. "I have nothing to offer you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "No home, no security, no future beyond the next fight for survival. You deserve so much better than a fugitive with a price on his head." "I don't want better," Rose said, covering his hands with her own. "I want you. I want this, whatever this is. I know it's dangerous and probably foolish and might end badly. But I've spent my whole life being careful and playing it safe. For once, I want to take a risk on something that feels real." He kissed her then, a kiss that was both tender and desperate, full of longing and fear and hope all tangled together. Rose kissed him back, her arms wrapping around his neck, feeling the solid warmth of him against her. For a moment, nothing else existed. Not the danger they were in, not the impossible odds they faced. Just this connection between them that felt both fragile and unbreakable. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Winterhawk rested his forehead against hers. "This changes everything," he whispered. "I know," Rose replied. "But maybe it needed to change. Maybe this is what gives us both the strength to see this through." They spent the rest of that night talking in a different way, sharing not just stories but dreams and fears and hopes for a future that seemed impossibly distant but suddenly worth fighting for. Winterhawk told her about the life he had imagined before the massacre, about the girl he had been promised to in an arrangement between families, a girl who had died along with everyone else. He spoke about the guilt he carried for surviving when so many others hadn't. "I used to think I survived because I was meant to," he said, "that I had some great purpose, some destiny to fulfill. But now I wonder if I survived simply by random chance, and I've been trying to create meaning out of meaninglessness ever since." "Maybe it's both," Rose suggested. "Maybe you survived by chance, but what you do with that survival, that's where the meaning comes from. You're not just existing. You're fighting to make sure your people aren't forgotten, to bring justice where there was only injustice. That matters. That means something." As dawn approached and Rose reluctantly prepared to leave, Winterhawk caught her hand. "Be careful going home. Coleman and his men, they're getting more aggressive. I saw riders passing near here yesterday afternoon. They're expanding their search pattern." "How close did they get?" Rose asked, alarmed. "Close enough that I had to hide in the root cellar for 3 hours. They didn't search the cabin, just looked around the property and moved on. But they'll be back. It's only a matter of time before they decide to search every abandoned building in the territory." Rose's mind raced. "Then we need to move you again, somewhere even more remote. Or," Winterhawk said carefully, "we need to stop running and start moving forward. My wounds are healed enough for travel now. It's time to make the journey to Kansas City. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes for everyone." Rose wanted to protest, to argue that he needed more time to recover fully, but she knew he was right. The situation was becoming untenable. Sooner or later, Coleman would find the Hutchinson place, and when he did, both she and Winterhawk would be caught. Better to take the initiative to move while they still had the element of choice. "All right," she said. "We'll start planning the journey. But we need to be smart about this. Kansas City is over 300 miles away. We'll need supplies, we'll need a believable cover story, and we'll need to avoid the main trails where the Blackwood Company will be watching." "I have some ideas about that," Winterhawk said. "Before I was ambushed, I was traveling with a group of drovers moving cattle to market. If we can find another cattle drive heading east, we might be able to join them. Drovers are always looking for extra hands, and a couple traveling together would be less suspicious than a lone man." Rose considered this. "You mean we should pretend to be married?" Winterhawk looked at her intently. "Would that bother you?" "Pretending, I mean?" Rose felt heat rise in her cheeks. "No," she said quietly. "It wouldn't bother me at all." Over the next 2 days, they made their preparations in secret. Rose gathered supplies bit by bit, small amounts that wouldn't be noticed missing from the homestead stores. Dried meat, hardtack, blankets, ammunition for her father's rifle that she had quietly borrowed. Winterhawk used the time to build his strength, pushing himself through exercises that left him exhausted but gradually increased his endurance. Thomas noticed something was different about his daughter. though he couldn't quite put his finger on what had changed. She seemed more focused, more determined, but also somehow softer around the edges. When he asked Catherine about it, she just smiled knowingly and said, "Our little girl is growing up, Thomas. Sometimes that means making choices we might not understand, but have to respect." The plan came together through a combination of careful observation and good fortune. Rose learned from a conversation overheard at the general store in town that a large cattle drive was assembling about 20 miles east, planning to head to Kansas City within the week. The trail boss was a man named McCready, known for being fair but demanding. If they could convince him to take them on, it would provide both cover and protection. On the third night after their kiss, Rose arrived at the Hutchinson place with news. "I talked to one of McCready's scouts at the trading post. The drive is leaving in 4 days. That's our window. We need to get to their assembly point and sign on before they head out." Winterhawk nodded. "And your parents? What will you tell them?" This was the part Rose had been dreading. "The truth," she said. "Or most of it, anyway. I'll tell them I'm going with you to Kansas City, that we're joining a cattle drive for cover. They won't like it, but they'll understand. My mother especially. She knows what it means to follow your heart, even when it's dangerous. Your father won't try to stop you?" Winterhawk asked. "He might try," Rose admitted. "But I'm not a child anymore. I can make my own choices, even difficult ones. And this feels like the right choice, Winterhawk. Not just because I care about you, though I do, but because your mission matters. Getting that evidence to Kansas City, making sure the truth comes out, it's bigger than just us. It's about justice for people who can't speak for themselves anymore." Winterhawk pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. "You are remarkable," he said into her hair. "Brave and fierce and good in ways I didn't know people could be. Whatever happens on this journey, however it ends, I want you to know that you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" Rose asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "Hope," he said simply. The next day, Rose sat her parents down and told them about the plan. As expected, Thomas's first reaction was vehement opposition. "Absolutely not. You're not running off to Kansas City with a man you barely know, a man with a price on his head. It's madness, Rose. You'll be killed or worse." "I know the risks, Pa," Rose said calmly, "but I'm going anyway. With or without your blessing. I'm 20 years old. I've spent my whole life being the good daughter, following the rules, staying safe. But safe isn't enough anymore. I need to do something that matters, something that makes a difference." Catherine placed a hand on her husband's arm, silencing his next protest. "Let her speak, Thomas." Rose took a deep breath. "Winterhawk is the last of his people. The Ashara were murdered, Pa. Not in a fair fight, not in battle, but slaughtered while they slept. Women, children, elders. All because they wouldn't sign away their land to men who valued gold more than human life. And the people responsible for that massacre are still in power, still profiting from that stolen land. If we do nothing, if we let Winterhawk die or give up, then those people win. They get away with genocide, and if you get caught helping him, you could hang," Thomas said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "The Blackwood Company has judges in their pocket. They could charge you with aiding a fugitive or conspiracy or any number of things. I won't lose my daughter to this fight, Rose. I can't." "You won't lose me," Rose said, though she couldn't promise that with certainty. "I'll be careful. We'll join the cattle drive, blend in with the other hands. By the time we reach Kansas City, the evidence will be in the hands of the newspaper. The story will be public, and the Blackwood Company won't be able to silence it." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, studying her daughter's face. Then she said, "You love him, don't you? This Winterhawk?" Rose felt her cheeks flush, but she didn't deny it. "Yes, Mama, I do. I know it's fast. I know it seems sudden. But when I'm with him, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Like all the pieces of my life have finally clicked into place." Thomas let out a long, heavy sigh. He looked at his wife, and some wordless communication passed between them. Finally, he turned back to Rose. "I can't stop you. You're right about that. But I can make sure you're as prepared as possible. You'll take the Winchester and plenty of ammunition. You'll take money, enough to get you home if things go wrong. And you'll promise me, Rose. Promise me you'll come back. Rose threw her arms around her father, tears streaming down her face. I promise, Pa, I'll come back. And when I do, the Ashara will have their justice. Catherine hugged them both, her own eyes wet. We'll tell the neighbors you've gone to visit your aunt in Missouri. That should buy you a few weeks before people start asking questions. They spent the rest of the day making final preparations. Thomas checked over the rifle, ensuring it was in perfect working order. Catherine packed a trunk with clothes and supplies, including the good dress she had been saving for Rose's eventual wedding. You might need to look respectable when you get to Kansas City, she said simply. As evening fell, Rose made one last trip to the Hutchinson place to tell Winterhawk everything was arranged. She found him outside, standing in the fading light, looking out over the prairie. When he heard her approach, he turned, and the smile on his face made her heart skip. We leave tomorrow night, she told him. My father is loaning us horses and supplies. We'll meet the cattle drive at their assembly point and sign on with McCready. From there, it's a straight shot to Kansas City. Winterhawk took her hands in his. Your parents agreed to this? Eventually, Rose said with a small laugh. Though I think my father is still hoping I'll change my mind. But I won't. This is what I want. You are what I want. He kissed her then, soft and sweet, a promise of things to come. When they broke apart, he said, I retrieved the documents from their hiding place today. They're sewn into the lining of my saddlebag. Even if someone searches us, they won't find them unless they tear the leather apart. Good, Rose said. Then everything is ready. Tomorrow we start our journey, and in a few weeks, the whole territory will know the truth about what happened to the Ashara people. They stood together in the gathering darkness, watching the stars begin to appear overhead. Rose thought about all the ways her life had changed in such a short time, how a simple decision to help a dying stranger had set in motion events that would alter her future forever. She should have been terrified, but instead she felt alive in a way she never had before. No matter what happens, Winterhawk said quietly, I want you to know that meeting you was a gift. You've shown me that there's still goodness in the world, still people worth fighting for. That means more than you know. Rose leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. We're going to make it, she said with a confidence she didn't entirely feel, but chose to believe in anyway. We're going to get to Kansas City, publish your evidence, and make sure everyone knows what the Blackwood Company did. And then, maybe, we can start thinking about what comes after. What comes after? Winterhawk repeated, as if testing the words. I haven't let myself think about an after for 8 years. It felt like tempting fate, like hoping for something impossible. Start thinking about it now, Rose urged. Because we're going to make it happen. Together. He held her close as full darkness fell, and in that moment, despite all the dangers ahead, despite the impossible odds they faced, Rose allowed herself to hope. Hope for justice, hope for the future, and hope that love might be strong enough to overcome even the darkest of histories. The cattle drive assembled at dawn 3 days later, a chaotic mass of bawling livestock, shouting men, and clouds of dust that turned the morning air thick and golden. Rose and Winterhawk arrived on horseback just as the trail boss, a grizzled man named McCready with a beard that reached halfway down his chest, was giving final instructions to his crew. They had spent the previous night camped a few miles away, waiting for the right moment to approach. McCready looked them over with shrewd eyes that had seen every kind of trouble the frontier had to offer. You two looking for work? He asked, his voice rough as sandpaper. Yes, sir. Rose said, keeping her voice steady. We're heading to Kansas City, and we heard you might need extra hands. My husband here is good with horses, and I can cook and mend and handle a rifle if needed. The word husband came more easily than she had expected, and she saw Winterhawk's eyes flicker with something warm and complicated when she said it. They had agreed on this story, this fiction that allowed them to travel together without raising questions. But speaking it aloud made it feel almost real. McCready grunted, looking between them with obvious skepticism. Husband, eh? You two seem awful young to be hitched. And you, he said, turning his attention fully to Winterhawk. "You got that look about you, like you're running from something." "I don't need trouble on my drive." Winterhawk met the trail boss's gaze without flinching. "We all run from something, Mr. McCready. The question is whether we're running towards something better or just running. We're good workers, we'll pull our weight, and we won't cause problems. That's all you need to know." For a long moment, McCready stared at Winterhawk, and Rose held her breath, certain they were about to be turned away. Then the trail boss laughed, a sharp bark of sound. "Fair enough. I like a man who can speak his mind without dancing around it. You're hired, both of you. Pay is $30 for the full drive to Kansas City, plus meals. You sleep with the crew, take your turn on night watch, and if there's trouble with rustlers or hostile tribes, you fight." "Those terms acceptable?" "More than acceptable," Rose said quickly, before McCready could reconsider. "Good. Get yourselves settled with the chuck wagon. We move out in an hour." The crew consisted of 15 men, most of them weathered cowhands who had spent more years under open sky than under roofs. They eyed Rose with curiosity and varying degrees of suspicion, unaccustomed to having a woman on the trail, but the presence of Winterhawk at her side kept most comments to respectful nods. Only one man, a lanky drover named Sykes with pale eyes and a perpetual sneer, seemed inclined to make trouble. Mighty unusual. "Bringing a wife on a cattle drive," Sykes said loudly enough for everyone to hear as Rose and Winterhawk were stowing their gear. "Most men got sense enough to leave their women at home where they belong." Winterhawk turned slowly to face Sykes, and Rose saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. "My wife goes where I go," he said quietly, "and she can outshoot and outride half the men here. If that's a problem for you, we can settle it now." Sykes opened his mouth, clearly ready to escalate, but McCready's voice cut through the tension. "Sykes, shut your fool mouth and get to work. I don't care if someone's riding with us in a wedding dress and tiara, long as they pull their weight. Now move." The confrontation diffused, but Rose could feel Sykes's hostile gaze following them as they went about their business. It was a reminder that danger didn't just come from the Blackwood Company. Out here on the trail, with weeks of hard travel ahead, tensions could flare for any reason or no reason at all. The drive got underway, with the controlled chaos of 1,500 head of cattle being urged into motion. Rose had never seen so many animals in one place, a living river of hide and horn flowing across the prairie like some ancient migration. The noise was overwhelming, the constant lowing of cattle mixed with the shouts of drovers and the thunder of hooves against hard-packed earth. She and Winterhawk were assigned to ride drag, the dustiest and least desirable position at the rear of the herd, where they ate dirt kicked up by thousands of hooves. It was miserable work, but it also meant they were relatively isolated from the rest of the crew, able to talk quietly without being overheard. Winterhawk used the time to teach her things he thought she might need to know. How to read the behavior of cattle and predict when they might spook. How to position herself to turn a wandering steer back toward the herd. How to conserve her energy over long hours in the saddle. "You're a natural at this," he said on the third day, genuine admiration in his voice, as Rose expertly guided her horse to cut off 3 cattle that had tried to break away from the herd. "If this whole justice mission doesn't work out, you could have a future as a drover," Rose laughed, wiping dust and sweat from her face. "Somehow I don't think this is the life for me long term, but I have to admit there's something freeing about it. No walls, no boundaries, just open sky and the work in front of you. That's what I loved about it when I was younger," Winterhawk said, his expression turning wistful. "My people spent half the year following the buffalo herds, living on the move. There's a rhythm to that kind of life, a simplicity that modern civilization has lost. Everything you need can be carried on your back or on a horse. Everything else is just weight holding you down." They fell into a comfortable routine over the following days. Up before dawn to help break camp, long hours in the saddle managing the herd, evening meals around the campfire where Rose learned to tune out the crude jokes and rougher elements of trail life, then collapsing into their bedrolls for a few hours of sleep before the cycle began again. It was exhausting work, but Rose found herself adapting to it, her body growing stronger, her skills improving. McCready proved to be a fair boss, demanding but not cruel. And he had a gift for reading the land that kept them on good grass and near reliable water sources. The other drovers gradually accepted Rose's presence, particularly after she demonstrated her shooting skills by bringing down a pronghorn antelope at 200 yards, providing fresh meat for the crew. Even Sykes seemed to grudgingly respect her competence, though his eyes still held that predatory gleam whenever he looked at her. It was on the 8th night that Rose first noticed they were being followed. She had drawn the late watch, that lonely stretch of hours between midnight and dawn, when the world felt suspended between darkness and light. The cattle were settled, just occasional restless stirring, and she was making her slow circuit around the herd when she saw it. A campfire in the distance, perhaps 2 miles back along their trail. Too far to see details, but close enough to be concerning. She immediately rode to wake McCready, keeping her voice low and urgent. "There's someone behind us. Been following our dust trail for at least a day, maybe longer." The trail boss came fully awake instantly, the mark of a man who had spent decades sleeping with one eye open. He followed Rose to a slight rise, where they could see the distant fire without being silhouetted against the sky. McCready studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "Could be nothing," he said finally. "Another outfit heading the same direction, but could be rustlers scouting us out, waiting for a chance to hit the herd. Or could be someone looking for something specific. You and your husband got anything you want to tell me, Rose? Any reason someone might be tracking you?" Rose felt her heart hammer in her chest. McCready was no fool, and lying to him now would only make things worse if the truth came out later. "My husband had some trouble back in the territory," she said carefully. "Business dispute with a mining company. They might have sent men after him." "Business dispute," McCready repeated flatly. "That the kind of dispute that ends with bullets?" "It might be," Rose admitted. McCready was quiet for a long moment, and Rose braced herself for him to demand they leave the drive immediately. Instead, he said, "Here's what we're going to do. We don't change our routine, don't let on that we know we're being followed, but we double the watch, keep weapons close, and if those riders come within shooting range of this herd, we treat them as rustlers." "Understood. You're not going to send us away?" Rose asked, surprised. "I don't abandon people mid-trail unless they give me cause," McCready said. "You and your husband have worked hard, pulled your weight, caused no trouble. Whatever's chasing you, you'll face it with the backing of this crew. That's how we do things out here." Relief flooded through Rose, so intense it almost made her dizzy. "Thank you, Mr. McCready. You don't know what that means to us. Just make sure it's worth it," the trail boss said. "Whatever you're running from or running toward, make sure it's worth the risk you're taking. Now get back to your watch." Rose told Winterhawk about the followers as soon as her watch ended, and he was preparing to take his turn. His face went grim in the pre-dawn light. "Coleman," he said with certainty. "He must have picked up our trail when we joined the drive. He's following at a distance, waiting for an opportunity. What do we do?" Rose asked. "We keep moving forward," Winterhawk said. "We're safer with the herd than we would be on our own. Coleman won't risk attacking while we're surrounded by 15 armed men. But we need to be ready for him to make a move when we reach Kansas City and separate from the group." The knowledge that they were being hunted cast a shadow over the following days, though they tried to maintain their normal routine and not show fear. Rose found herself constantly scanning the horizon, looking for signs of pursuit. Sometimes she would catch glimpses of riders in the distance, always staying just beyond clear identification, patient as wolves trailing a wounded deer. The strain was beginning to show on Winterhawk, too. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, spending his free time checking and rechecking his weapons, making sure the documents sewn into his saddlebag remained secure. Rose could see the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, the knowledge that so much depended on getting those papers to Kansas City. It was during one of their rare moments of privacy, watering the horses at a creek while the rest of the crew was occupied with moving the herd across, that Winterhawk finally voiced what had been troubling him. "I've been thinking about what happens when we reach the city," he said quietly. "Even if we get the evidence to the newspaper, even if they publish it, the Blackwood Company won't just accept defeat. They'll fight back, use every resource they have to discredit the story and destroy anyone involved in revealing it." "I know," Rose said, "but that doesn't change what we have to do." "It changes what I'm asking you to risk," Winterhawk said, turning to face her fully. "Rose, once this story breaks, your name will be connected to it. You'll be marked as an enemy of powerful men. Your family could face retaliation. You could spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. Is that really what you want?" Rose took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "What I want is to be with you. What I want is to help you finish what you started. What I want is to live in a world where people like your family get justice instead of being erased from history. Yes, it's dangerous. Yes, there will be consequences. But some things are worth the risk. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most stubborn," Winterhawk said, but there was affection in his voice. "Why can't I be both?" Rose replied with a slight smile. He kissed her then, gentle and lingering, and for a moment the danger and uncertainty faded away, leaving only the connection between them. When they finally pulled apart, Rose saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not just attraction or affection, but something deeper, something that looked a lot like love. The turning point came 2 weeks into the drive, when they crossed into Kansas and the landscape began to change from open prairie to more settled farmland. They were getting close to Kansas City now, perhaps another week of travel, and the tension in the camp was rising. The mysterious riders were still following, closer now, sometimes visible in broad daylight. McCready had taken to riding out with his rifle to confront them, but each time he got close, they would scatter, only to reappear hours later. It was Sykes who finally precipitated the crisis. Rose had noticed him watching her and Winterhawk with increasing hostility over the past few days, and she suspected he had overheard something or put pieces together that made him suspicious. Her fears were confirmed one evening when Sykes approached McCready's campfire, where most of the crew was gathered. "I got something to say," Sykes announced loudly. "About those two we picked up back at the start of the drive. The so-called married couple." McCready looked up from his coffee, his expression dangerous. "This better be good, Sykes." "I was in town 2 days ago when we passed through Junction City," Sykes continued. "Saw a wanted poster at the marshal's office. $500 reward for information leading to the capture of a fugitive. Indian man, description matches our quiet friend here pretty damn close. Wanted for murder and theft by the Blackwood Company." The camp went silent. Every eye turned to Winterhawk, who had gone very still. Rose felt her hand move instinctively toward the pistol at her hip, but Winterhawk caught her wrist, stopping her with a gentle pressure and a slight shake of his head. "That true?" McCready asked, his voice neutral, but his hand resting on his own weapon. "You wanted by the law?" Winterhawk stood slowly, hands visible and away from his weapons. "It's true that the Blackwood Company wants me. Whether that makes me a criminal or them depends on who's telling the story." "He didn't murder anyone," Rose said fiercely, stepping forward to stand beside Winterhawk. "The Blackwood Company massacred his entire people 10 years ago. Every man, woman, and child murdered in their sleep so the company could steal their land. Winterhawk is the only survivor, and he has proof of what they did. That's why they want him dead. Not because he's a criminal, but because he threatens to expose their crimes." Sykes laughed harshly. "Pretty story. But I'm thinking $500 says we don't need to hear it. We could tie these two up, deliver them to the nearest Blackwood office, and split the reward 15 ways. Several of the other drovers looked interested at the mention of money, and Rose saw the situation teetering on the edge of violence. Her hand tightened on her pistol, knowing that if this went bad, they were outnumbered and would likely die here in this camp. It was Macready who broke the tension. He stood up, his considerable height and authority commanding attention. "Nobody's tying up anybody," he said flatly, "and nobody's collecting any rewards. These two signed on to work, and they've worked hard and honest. That's good enough for me, but the money," Sykes protested. "The money," Macready interrupted, his voice hard as iron, "comes from a company that's about as trustworthy as a snake. You really want to do business with people who, if this lady's story is true, murdered entire families for profit. That sit right with your conscience, Sykes?" Sykes opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly not having expected this response. Around the campfire, Rose could see the other drovers considering Macready's words, the balance shifting away from greed and towards something better. "Here's what's going to happen," Macready continued. "Winterhawk and Rose are going to continue with us to Kansas City. Anyone who's got a problem with that can draw your pay now and leave. But if you stay loyal to the crew. We don't sell each other out. That's the code we live by out here. Understood?" There was a long moment of silence. Then one by one, the drovers nodded their agreement. Even Sykes, though he did so with obvious reluctance and a poisonous look at Winterhawk. The crisis had passed, but Rose knew it had been close. Too close. Later that night, after most of the camp had settled down to sleep, Macready called Rose and Winterhawk over to his wagon. "I need the full story," he said without preamble. "Not the edited version. The whole truth. If I'm going to keep defending you two, I need to know exactly what I'm defending." So they told him everything. The massacre of the Ashara people, the forged treaty, the years Winterhawk had spent in hiding, the documents he had stolen from the territorial archives, the plan to deliver them to a newspaper in Kansas City. Macready listened without interruption, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When they finished, the trail boss was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "That's one hell of a story. If it's true, if you really have proof of what you're claiming, this could bring down some powerful people. It could also get you both killed, we know," Winterhawk said. "And you're still planning to go through with it?" "We have to," Rose said. "If we don't, if we let fear stop us, then the Ashara died for nothing. Their story dies with them. We can't let that happen." Macready nodded slowly. "All right. When we get to Kansas City, I'll take you directly to the newspaper office myself. I know the editor there, Benjamin Cartwright. Good man, honest journalist. If anyone will publish your story and have the backbone to stand behind it, it's him. But you need to understand something. Once this goes public, there's no taking it back. Your lives will never be the same." "They're already not the same," Winterhawk said. "Haven't been since the day I found my family dead and my village burning. At least this way, their deaths might mean something." The rest of the drive passed in a strange state of suspended tension. The riders still followed, Coleman and his men never quite close enough to confront, but always present, waiting. Sykes continued to glower and mutter, though he made no more overt moves against them. And Rose and Winterhawk grew closer, bound together by shared purpose and the knowledge that everything they cared about hung in the balance. On the final night before they would reach Kansas City, Rose couldn't sleep. She lay in her bedroll, staring up at the stars, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. A month ago, she had been a simple homesteader's daughter with no greater ambition than to maybe one day have a small farm of her own. Now she was on the edge of something monumental, something that could reshape the territory's history. Winterhawk rolled over to face her, apparently unable to sleep either. "Having second thoughts?" he whispered. "No," Rose said honestly. "Just thinking about how strange life is, how one moment can change everything. If I hadn't gone hunting that day, if I'd taken a different path, if I'd decided to leave you there in the grass because it was too dangerous to get involved, none of this would be happening." "Do you regret it?" Winterhawk asked. "Saving me, I mean. Knowing everything you know now, all the danger and complication it's brought into your life, do you wish you'd made a different choice? Rose turned to look at him, seeing his face outlined in starlight. "Not for a second," she said firmly. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever comes after, I don't regret choosing to help you. I don't regret falling in love with you. I don't regret any of it." Winterhawk reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "When this is over," he said quietly, "when the story is published and the truth is out there, I want us to build something together. A real life, not just survival. I don't know what that looks like yet, or even if it's possible. But I want to try. With you." Tears pricked Rose's eyes, but they were good tears. Hopeful tears. "I want that too," she whispered. More than anything. They lay there together under the vast prairie sky, hands clasped, hearts aligned, on the eve of the moment that would define the rest of their lives. Tomorrow they would reach Kansas City. Tomorrow the world would learn what had happened to the Ashara people. Tomorrow everything would change. But tonight, in this quiet moment before the storm, they had each other. And somehow that felt like enough. Kansas City rose from the prairie like a promise. Buildings of brick and wood stretching toward the sky. Streets crowded with wagons and people moving with the purposeful energy of commerce and ambition. Rose had never seen so many structures in one place, never heard such a cacophony of voices and sounds. Beside her, Winterhawk sat rigid in his saddle, his eyes scanning the crowds with the wariness of a man who had learned never to trust safety. Macready led them through the chaos of the stockyards where the cattle would be sold, past saloons and shops and hotels, until they reached a modest two-story building with a sign that read Kansas City Chronicle in faded letters. The trail boss dismounted and gestured for them to do the same. "Benjamin Cartwright's office is on the second floor," he said. "I'll go up first, make sure he's willing to see you." While they waited, Rose felt the weight of eyes on them. She turned slowly and saw Coleman standing across the street, flanked by 4 other men, all armed. He smiled when their eyes met, a cold expression that held no humor. He made no move to approach, simply stood there watching, a silent reminder that the Blackwood Company's reach extended even here. Macready reappeared in the doorway. "Cartwright will see you both now." Benjamin Cartwright was a thin man in his 50s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He gestured for them to sit and studied them with sharp, intelligent eyes. Rose told him everything, while Winterhawk carefully extracted the documents from his saddlebag's hidden lining. The papers were worn and creased from being carried so long, but the text was still legible, official stamps and signatures marking them as authentic. Cartwright spent nearly an hour examining the documents, his face growing increasingly troubled as he read through correspondence between territorial officials and Blackwood executives, discussing the Ashara problem in terms that made it clear they had planned the massacre months in advance. "This is remarkable and terrible," Cartwright said finally. "These documents prove conclusively that the territorial government and the Blackwood Company conspired to commit genocide for profit. I'll run it as a series, front page, with reproductions of the key documents. It will take about a week to prepare, but once it hits the streets, there will be no putting this back. Are you prepared for what comes next?" Winterhawk looked at Rose, and she saw in his eyes all the years of grief and loss and determination that had led to this moment. "My people were murdered and forgotten," he said quietly. "If publishing this story means their deaths are remembered, if it means justice might finally be served, then yes, I'm prepared for whatever comes next." The week that followed was the longest of Rose's life. They stayed in a boarding house on the edge of town, essentially prisoners in a small room, venturing out only after dark. Macready brought them food and news, reporting that Coleman and his men were searching the city methodically. On the 7th day, Macready arrived with the morning edition of the Kansas City Chronicle. The headline screamed across the front page, "Massacre Exposed," how the Blackwood Company and territorial officials conspired to commit genocide. Rose read the article with tears streaming down her face. It was all there, the forged treaty, the planned massacre, the deliberate destruction of an entire people for profit. "It's done," Winterhawk said softly. The truth is out. My people's story has been told. But that afternoon, the boarding house owner burst into their room, her face pale with fear. Men are coming with guns. You must leave now, through the back. They ran through alleys and crowded streets, splitting up and reuniting, finally finding temporary shelter in a hay barn. They climbed into the loft and burrowed into the hay, listening to Coleman's frustrated curses echoing below. "We've done what we came to do," Winterhawk whispered. "The story is out there. Nothing they do to us now can change that." Below them, the barn door opened again. But this time, the voice was familiar and welcome. Winterhawk rose. "It's McCready. Come down. It's safe." They emerged to find McCready and the other drovers from the cattle drive, all armed. "Cartwright sent word that Coleman was after you," McCready explained. "Figured you might need some backup. Now come on." Cartwright arranged for you to meet with a federal marshal. Your story caught the attention of folks in Washington. You've got official protection now. 3 months later, Rose and Winterhawk stood on the steps of the federal courthouse in Denver, watching as the former territorial governor and 6 Blackwood Company executives were led away in chains. The trials had been swift and decisive, the evidence too overwhelming to deny. "Is this what justice feels like?" Winterhawk asked quietly. "I think so," Rose replied. "It doesn't bring back what was lost, but maybe it prevents the same thing from happening to others." They had been married 2 weeks earlier, a small ceremony with her parents and McCready as witnesses. Now, as they prepared to return to the Dakota Territory to begin building their life together, Winterhawk pulled Rose close. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing me as a person worth saving, for believing my story was worth telling." Rose smiled up at him. This man she had found dying beside his horse, unaware he was the last of his line. "We saved each other," she said, "and we're going to spend the rest of our lives making sure the Ashara people are never forgotten." Together they walked down the courthouse steps toward their future, 2 people who had changed history by refusing to accept injustice, by choosing courage over safety, and by believing that sometimes love and truth are powerful enough to overcome even the darkest of legacies. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.